All right, in this next section, we're going to talk about some factors that maybe you can consider as like uh, preconditions or helpful things. They don't directly affect the other factors we talked about, but they can have lots of indirect effects on them. So let me go ahead and get started so I can show you what I mean. So I'm going to change that nonsense and make it not be looking like that. Okay. Okay. So in this next section, we're going to talk about some things that can have an indirect effect on development, but they may not be directly affecting capital or human capital or technology, but they have a lot of indirect effects on them because they affect how well markets work and the incentives that the actors in the market have. So let's start with this one of enforcing and protecting property rights. So it's enforcing and protecting property rights. So what are property rights? So property rights are, well, people have control and authority over their own resources. So people have control and authority over their own resources. So okay, so what kind of resources are we talking here? So we're talking resources like money. Okay, they might have money. We're talking property. This could be land or buildings, etc. We're talking their business, their firms, and we're also talking their own labor, their labor, their own labor, right? They can choose to work. They can choose where they want to work, assuming the company will hire them, and they can choose not to work or where they don't want to work. Okay, so without these, markets aren't going to work very well. So markets require these property rights. The markets will require property rights. Without property rights, it's hard for markets to work because the resources can't move around where they want to move around or where the incentives are. These are required by markets. So what are some things that can be done? Now, this is sort of one of those factors that's kind of better said than done. It's easy to say this, but this is very difficult to build, especially if a country has a problem with the rule of law or the well-functioning justice system. This can be extremely difficult to build. But let's talk about it anyways. Okay, so it's it's part of it is like a well-functioning justice system. Okay, so the courts work. Things don't take too long to process. Things are generally fair, or at least according to the law. And so things are kind of predictable, what's going to happen most of the time. Along with this is we have the rule of law. One of the key things about having rule of law is the idea that no one is above the law. Okay, so if a justice system is not functioning very well, then the law may just be for ordinary people, but very important people, or the CEOs of large firms or something may be able to get away with just about anything. And in that case, you can say that country doesn't really have the rule of law, or not a very strong rule of law. We also then say, well, contracts can be enforced. Again, if you have a contract with somebody about delivery of a good or some kind of business relationship that you're entered into, that these can be legally enforced. That they cannot just be changed at a whim if the person is powerful or important or something like this. Another one is that fraud, and doesn't mean that you won't have fraud or corruption, but it's that when they're discovered, they're punished. Okay, they're punished if they're discovered. So let me give an example about this, where this would be not very strong. Justice system is in Uganda. Just to talk about Uganda again, several years ago, several government officials stole large amounts of money from an HIV fund, and it was discovered and kind of publicly known, but not a whole lot happened to them, and they were still, sort of in the government. So this would be an example of not a very strong rule of law, corruption and fraud allowed to blossom. And when you have this, you're going to have lots of stealing. And what happens, well, some of you might be saying, well, how's this property rights? Well, if somebody is taking government resources that are meant for something else, well, these resources were allocated to, for example, people with HIV, and then now somebody else is taking them, so they're really, infringing on another person's property right that legally they were supposed to have received this treatment or these funds. And the last one I will say here bribes or personal relationships are not necessary to conduct normal business. Personal relationships with government officials are not necessary to conduct normal business. So you can imagine if a country has all of these things to a pretty good extent, it's going to be an attractive place to start a business. It'll be an attractive place for firms to operate. It'll be a relatively easy place and predictable place for firms to operate. And if a country has none of these things, then it could be a very difficult place. You might find capital flight where even wealthy people that are from your country want to move their financial capital abroad, and you may find foreign investors are a little bit wary to move into this country. Free, or let's say freer trade. So one thing that's quite clear, and again, it doesn't specifically impact directly impact any of the factors, but opening up to international trade definitely allows firms to specialize, and it allows growth in production. So opening up to trade. Okay, and now I want to talk about one final factor, which is free, or maybe you can say freer trade. Okay, and this is kind of like the property rights and the rule of law and the justice system. Doesn't necessarily directly impact the other things, although in the long run it could lead to more investment and more firms when they start and more creativity. But it sort of indirectly augments the other factors. Okay, so we're talking about, well, if a country opens up more to international trade and also engages more as an exporter into the international markets, but it also could be as an importer of certain things. What could happen? So there's kind of two main factors that we would expect to happen. So the first one is it gives a bigger market for selling goods. That's one. Maybe there's more than two. So a bigger market to sell to. So if you're a very small country, your domestic market is not going to be big enough to develop. In fact, there might be many goods that you can't produce well for your domestic market because you just won't be able to get to the scale that would be efficient, right? So if you're engaging in the world market, this allows you to reach a much bigger market and gives some big opportunities to your firms. Second thing, it allows us to specialize, right? So this allows specialization, which makes us more productive. Remember, if you read the section in the first chapter, I'm talking about specialization and how this increases productivity. So, and then the third one, and this is probably one of the really important ones. So it also brings products are not just something we use. It also brings a lot of new ideas and tech, right? So you can imagine. So this could be opening up borders to what's going on in the world market. Firms can acquire new ideas. They can also acquire new technology and better types of capital and better ways of doing things. So this last one of freer trade, in research is quite clear that countries that are more open to trade and more engaged with the world market have had a much bigger success story in growth. And this is especially true if the countries are smaller. If they're smaller, there's just no way their domestic market would be big enough to grow many, many different kinds of industries. And opening up the world market just opens them up to so many opportunities.